So it seems like AI burst into the public consciousness with the advent of ChatGPT about a year and a half ago. We were all stunned by an app that you could say, ask to write an LA pulp fiction story in Shakespearean English in 5 minutes. And could it be asked to write a recipe for a bioweapon? In fact, the Biden and indeed Trump administrations were working on AI policies that tried to address the implications of such breakthroughs long before ChatGPT emerged. In just the last year and a half, we've seen the White House blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, the Department of Defense responsible AI strategy, voluntary commitments to develop trustworthy AI from 7 leading tech firms, and then last October, the White House issued an executive order on safe and ethical uses of AI. So these efforts take on more resonance in the context of strategic competition with China. Let's open the discussion, maybe you, Tarun, with your articulation of the stakes as they relate to that competition. Are we aiming to win the race with China in AI? What happens if the United States falls behind? And if we're aiming to win, what is your strategy to win?
Well, thanks, Ellen, for moderating this discussion, and congratulations to Rush for launching the China Initiative today. It's really great to see this. I'm glad you've started, Ellen, with the framing of kind of public attention being focused now on AI after ChatGPT was announced, and now other companies launching similar, at this stage, co-pilot tools. I think it's an important framing, in part because you're right. There was an early focus on AI policy, certainly during this administration. And to credit the previous administration, there had been work, particularly in OSTP, on AI policy as well. But I think it speaks to the fact that we really do need to keep our eye on where the technology is going in a few years. And so while we'll continue to have a healthy debate now about what the capabilities are today, where they will be next year and the year after, and there should always be healthy skepticism about scaling laws and certain predictions, I think we do need to prepare for a future in which the capabilities that are unlocked in the next 2 or 3 years are really world historic potentially. We talk now about benchmarking capabilities that align with PhD level expertise in certain scientific fields, for example. And the question now is, are you the mean PhD? Are you at the 90th percentile? And that's kind of where the debate is right now. And so I think we really need to get our heads around what that means for our economies and for national security, really, to your point. And that really covers a range of operations. When we're talking about military affairs, it's yes, we've talked a lot about designing, modeling for nuclear weapons and for hypersonics, but it also goes to just kind of logistics, all of the things that make our militaries hum and make our intelligence operations work as well, including cyber operations.
What are the stakes for us, though, with respect to China?
Yeah.
Well, what's the national security?
So, look, I think, we sometimes in bureaucracies talk about AI as a force multiplier. I think that really understates what it is. It'd be like saying, there are many analogies here, and we can argue over them, but in the late 19th century, that electricity was a force multiplier, or the internal combustion engine was a force multiplier as well. That doesn't really get to what it could be. So the stakes are tremendous, and it's why we took the decision to do a few things in the course in the early days of the administration. One is to develop, obviously, investments in domestic hardware production, in chip production in the United States, so we have a more resilient supply of chips. As everyone in this room knows, and many people online know, what our dependencies look like right now. And second, we developed an export control policy focused on the most advanced chips that are necessary for AI applications, because we think that the stakes for national security are absolutely critical.
Can I just ask you, Maher, are we seeking to win the competition with China in AI? And what happens if we don't, in your words, or if we fall behind with respect to China in particular?
Sure. And also, let me also just congratulate Rush as well for pulling this off. And thanks for having us. I will say, though, at the outset that when I first started working in the administration, I did not expect to do as much technology policy as it relates to national security. But over the course of these 4 years, working closely with Tarun as well, it's clear how the intersection has really kind of cemented in a way where we have to have our eye on the ball with regard to how these advances are going to affect both the way in which our national security apparatus operates, but then also the way our adversaries and others abroad are looking to operate. So in this case, I think what we are trying to do is maintaining advantage for the United States in this field.
Because we're still ahead. China's still way behind us. So
right. And one of the charges that we have through something that was tasked out of the executive order on AI, which you mentioned, is a national security memorandum that we're working on at the moment, which is intended ultimately to ensure that our departments and agencies that work on national security are maintaining that advantage and working intensively to ensure that we are adopting AI responsibly, but also ambitiously, while also ensuring that we're using it. We're also preparing ourselves for how our adversaries might.
So I want to get to the National Security Memorandum in a minute, but first let's turn to export controls. In the last 2 years, the administration has imposed controls on shipments to China of the most advanced computer chips, or GPUs, that are needed to build large language models, those caches of information, massive caches of information on which AI systems are trained. What is the national security threat these controls are designed to address? What, for instance, is the relationship between a chip for a data center used to run LLMs and, say, the development of a hypersonic or nuclear weapon?
So, look, Elena, I think it's widely known that our national labs, right, particularly those involved in the nuclear enterprise, host some of our leading supercomputers and have for a very long time, because supercomputing is important for developing and modeling the use of advanced weapons systems. So no secret there. I think that's definitely one piece of this. We talked a lot about that. I think from a legal perspective, there's a WMD nexus that we established actually as a basis for some of our export controls. So that is a really important dimension of it. But part of what we're focused on now, and I know we'll talk a little bit about the National Security Memorandum that we're developing now, is that we're looking now at LLMs that are approaching super intelligent capabilities. You know, we can have debates about AGI capabilities. And our concern there is the potential revolutionary impacts on a broad range of military and intelligence and general national security applications. And we know that our adversaries are actively experimenting with all of those rapidly right now. And so we need to be doing the same thing right now. We need to be doing it consistent with responsible uses, guardrails, many of which, you know, I think are well established, but need to be adapted for this new technology.
Well, if these chips are so sensitive, why has no other allied country imposed similar controls? After all, although US companies design the leading edge chips, almost all of those advanced chips are produced in Taiwan and packaged in other foreign countries, which gives them the jurisdictional authority to impose controls. And we talk so much about the importance of allies and partners in these efforts.
Well, so I wouldn't agree with the premise. We do have key allies that actually are implementing controls that are critical for the tooling required to manufacture some of these chips. And then in addition, we have extensive, you know, conversations with our allies who are producing some of these chips as well. And none of this would be working without close cooperation with them either.
So it's often said that national security is economic security. Does this mean that there are also economic motives behind these controls? That is, are they designed to constrain China's economy or to help US companies economically? And is constraining China's economy good from a global economic standpoint? Either one of you is fine.
Yeah, look, we've been very clear and very directly with Beijing about this. That is not the design or intent of these controls. Now, let's be, we can have a forthright conversation to say, will there be potential collateral impacts? There may be, yes, but that is not the intent of them. The intent of them is to address our concern, which we believe is well-founded, that if China is able to accelerate the development of this technology on the frontier, it will quickly be taken up by the PLA, by intelligence services, and used against us and our allies.
And the question arises, too, that these export controls just accelerate the incentives for China to develop its own chips to use domestically, right? This dual circulation argument, as well as export to third countries where they'd compete with US design chips. And isn't that what they're doing now with the legacy chips, the more mature chips? How are you thinking about that?
Well, so look, I think the indigenization drive for China began some time ago. We could discuss when exactly it happened, but we had to make a decision in the early days of this administration about whether we were going to allow China to continue on the indigenization drive while having full access to all this technology in the meantime. And our view was that they had made a judgment, whether you think it was good or not, good for good reasons or not, that they needed to do that and press ahead. I think I'd also add, let's look at other sectors where we just let the market dynamics play out. How did that work out for us in solar, in telecom, in critical minerals and processing, in APIs for biopharma, where we just said China will indigenize if we have an industrial policy or if we have export controls. In general, I don't think that's worked out well for the United States or for our allies. And so we were committed to ensure that that didn't happen first in the semiconductor sector by investing in our own production as well, but also by ensuring that those technologies are not used in ways that undermine our national security.
You're referring to the CHIPS Act in part with the $39 billion for fabs. Some of these, I understand, won't come online until about 2030. Is that too late? I mean, after all, we've heard in the last panel that, we could well expect China to have invaded Taiwan before then.
Yeah, look, we have, I see John Neufer from SIA is here, who can tell you that some of this capacity is going to come online sooner than that. Mm-hmm. Some of these investments actually were already underway, and what CHIPS Act is doing is actually expanding the footprint on the one hand, and also ensuring that we have leading edge capabilities in that footprint as well. And it's not the United States doing this alone. I think, if we had wanted to do it alone, the CHIPS Act would have needed to be, instead of around $52 billion, closer to $400 billion. If we were aiming for autarky, that was not the design or intent of the act. So instead, we also have allies, partners, and like-minded countries that are also investing, whether it's Japan, Korea expanding its own production, the European Union, and now India getting into the game as well.
And so far, these controls that we've been talking about have been on the compute side, right? On the chips. What about the technology and software that are needed to produce AI applications, the so-called model weights? Are you thinking about imposing controls on those? And if so, how effective would they be when, some of this can just easily be shared across borders? And how willing would other allies and partners be to impose similar controls?
Yeah. Well, look, I think we are keeping a close eye on the latest models as they are released, whether they're open source, whether they're proprietary, doesn't matter. We want to know what are their capabilities. We've stood up a new safety institute at the Commerce Department under NIST, which is charged with developing evaluations to do that testing as well. I think there are a few dimensions to this. The first dimension is this: do we have adequate cybersecurity at the firms that are developing leading edge models? That's an ongoing conversation that we have with the leading labs that are doing that. And I think there's a broad agreement in the government and with those firms that we need to do more in that space.
What are you doing? And maybe Maher, you want to talk to that, especially if it involves cyber issues.
Yeah, I think there are a number of security challenges that both the companies are very aware of, but also as a government that we're looking to invest in. Everything from physical security, human security, cyber defenses as well, and generally having counterintelligence awareness with regard to the work that they're doing. I mean, these are companies in the United States that are making rapid advances, and they are a significant target for both for competitive reasons and also by foreign adversaries. So it is going to be an area of work. Well, it's an area that we're galvanizing already, but it's going to be an area of work that we're going to build into the National Security Memorandum as well, which is how can we bring the resources, the insight to bear that the U.S. government has to assist in this space to the greatest extent possible.
All right, I wanted to, let's move right over then now to the National Security Memorandum, the NSM, which is something that I guess is supposed to be rolled out any day now, very soon. I think the EO gave you 270 days or roughly 9 months to draft, and that deadline is coming up this week, next week, soon?
Soon. I think our lawyers told us that we can say this summer.
This summer. Okay. All right. Well, why don't you open here by talking about, since you're both at the center of this, right? Just give us a little more of an understanding of who this will apply to. What potentials are you most interested in? What is the potential that you're most interested in encouraging? And what applications or scenarios are you most concerned about preventing, deterring, or avoiding through the NSM? So who does this apply to?
Sure.
Sure,
I'll start and then I'll turn it to Tarun. So just in terms of scene setting, and Ellen, as you mentioned earlier, this National Security Memorandum is actually tasked by the President's executive order. So for the most part, the President's executive order sets aside questions of use governance with regard to what we call national security systems, as well as defense and intelligence uses by the US federal government. So as a result of that, instead, the executive order tasks the development of this National Security Memorandum to ensure that we have standardized, uniform guidance to the extent possible across the relevant agencies.
So DOD, ICE, the intelligence community?
This would be DOD, would be all the relevant intelligence agencies, but it doesn't just stop there. It includes the Department of Energy, the national labs at the Department of Energy, but it also can apply to other agencies that have a national security mission as well.
DHS, FBI.
So there are elements of DHS, elements of FBI and DOJ, and also smaller agencies, our State Department even. And there are other agencies that are involved in this process from across the US government. A joke that we've had is the process that we're running, we call it a small group. It's the largest small group you can imagine. I mean, the number of agencies that are part of this. So we are driving very hard to get this done in time. We have every expectation that we will. But it's a complex task because what we're trying to do is we're trying to address two elements that were tasked in the executive order. One is about government governance and use by the federal government. But then secondly, also, how do we protect US national security interests from foreign use and misuse of this technology? So it has those two components.
And does it also apply to the companies that are providing some of the AI software, hardware capabilities to these agencies?
Well, so what it is providing is direction to the agencies within what is applicable by law. So it is going to have guidance to the agencies of how they should be seeking to adopt and use and experiment with AI. But there are also going to be some limitations as a result based on that, based on what a national security memorandum can do in terms of providing direction. This is not direction to the private sector, it's direction to the federal government on how to adopt and use it. That said, there are a wide range of issues that we are seeking to tackle here. Everything, for example, which Tarun can talk about in more detail, talent, both talent, how do we ensure talent across the United States? Preserving, if you want, and building on the talent base that we have here, but also how do you build the talent and expertise within the US federal government? Because one of the issues that is different in this case is we're very conscious that this is a technology that has not spun out, at least in its modern form, from work in the federal government. This is a frontier capability that has been developed outside of the federal government, and we're approaching
in the private sector by firms like Google, Microsoft, OpenAI. Right?
And we're very conscious of how do we ensure that we are folding it into the operations of these agencies in a way that is responsible, that has a degree of interoperability as well, so that we don't create silos across agencies as well in ways that may hinder use over time. And how do we galvanize experimentation as well so that we are seeing what works and what doesn't work?
So what kinds of experimentation might we see within the national security agencies with respect to AI in terms of what they're seeking to use these applications for, and then talk about the guardrails you're thinking of imposing on that?
Sure, and maybe Tarun, I don't know if you're best positioned if you want to explain kind of what's different about these frontier models and the extent to which they may be particularly effective in some contexts.
Yeah, well, honestly, Ellen, I think for people here, online members of CFR, I mean, a lot of this is well known to all of you because all of you are experimenting in your enterprises with this technology right now. And you can see actually right now kind of how much your business operations could change or already are changing as a result of it, depending on how quickly you're operationalizing this. So, everything is, I said earlier, from, logistics to going forward, I think we'll see a lot more changes to how we think about research operations in a lot of enterprises as well. So really covering the waterfront. And so what we want to do now is, I think, acknowledge first that in the Defense Department or the intelligence community, we actually, many government components have been actually pioneers in developing and deploying bespoke kinds of AI for a long time, right? I mean, we have a lot of weapon systems that you could say have been using some form of autonomy for a long time, and the same thing, in the intelligence community as well. I think what we want to make sure we're doing now is to ensure that everyone who's using those applications sees what the potential is for this new paradigm of AI and what the impacts will be. Where it makes sense to keep doing what they've been doing, and that enables you to keep down costs, which we have to be mindful of, then that's what we should keep doing. But where the new paradigm eats the old paradigm, and you have a very significant shift in capabilities, then obviously we don't want to be behind the curve from our adversaries in that context. And sometimes you just don't have the same feedback loop that you might in the corporate sector, where you're kind of in the scrum of day-to-day commercial competition. We may not see that as readily in the national security world between countries. And so we think it's our duty to make sure that we're pressing on that now. And that's certainly kind of the direction from the national security
What do you mean by that when you say we might not see something within what's going on within the private sector?
Yeah. The situation we want to avoid is strategic surprise, where in the context of some sort of intelligence operation or on the battlefield, we see that our adversaries have both developed, adopted this technology more quickly than we have, with a significant augmentation of their capability. And that obviously would be an unacceptable scenario, and that's something that we have to avoid by kind of pushing on the experimentation now.
And what I would say also, Ellen, is you're seeing a kind of a rapid acceleration for now, and we should maintain healthy skepticism, as Tarun said, but a rapid acceleration in these capabilities, their ability to provide value add in a number of different domains. And the question is, how do you ensure within the US government, where each agency, or sometimes even within agencies, they have very different missions, how are they building that in, experimenting with it, seeing what works, what doesn't work, whether there are methods that they're currently using that are bespoke but highly attuned to the work they need to do, and those should remain as they are. But there may be areas where ultimately moving towards adopting use of these sorts of tools, and the more advanced tools that will come over time, will actually help the mission as well.
I want to just stay focused on the red side for a little bit. How are you thinking to ascertain or prevent this strategic surprise? What sorts of steps are you thinking about that you can implement either through your own capabilities or through working with the private sector or somehow to make sure you're not caught strategically, surprised or off guard by what China can or Russia can unfold on the battlefield or in the RIC?
Yeah. So I think a couple of things. I think it's really important for our agencies, one, to have the internal expertise to understand the shifts that are happening in this domain and have their ear to the ground and are engaging with companies to understand what's happening in the private sector. So I think that's one key area where we want to make sure that there's a lot of good work that's done now, that continues apace, and that is built into the way in which they're approaching this technology as it shifts. I think the second element is ensuring that they are experimenting with this technology as well to see what sorts of use cases work and don't work and how effective they might be. And the third, which I can speak less about, but it is an area of focus, is in my capacity as the coordinator for intelligence defense, is how are we postured as a government to understand what's happening elsewhere around the world? And how are we investing in the resources to make that happen? What I will say is this national security memorandum will be to the greatest extent possible unclassified. We're going to try to ensure that we are speaking to many audiences at once, but there will be a portion that will remain classified as well, which will speak to some of the other work that we're expecting agencies to do. So it's going to have both. But Tarun, I don't know if you have more on that.
No, that's right.
And when it comes to the sorts of restrictions, constraints, guardrails you're thinking of imposing, be it on the agencies or on working with the companies that are really providing these capabilities, how are you thinking about that? Are you thinking about devising guardrails in terms of avoiding specific outcomes or on norms, standards? Tell us a little bit about your thinking, what we might expect to see in this NSM in terms of guardrails.
Yeah, I think so. I think the first thing is we are building on guardrails that have already been devised. For example, within the Department of Defense, where there's been an intense amount of work over the last few years to ensure that we build an approach that is human-centered for a lot of the work that we're doing. At the same time, we're also dealing with a circumstance where we have, as I mentioned earlier, we have agencies that have very different missions across the board, and also they have sometimes different infrastructure that they need to use. And how do we create an incentive structure that is, and a flexible enough governance structure that allows them to work both in ways that are individualized for the work they need to do, that builds on the infrastructure and the bespoke models, for example, that they've done, but also is increasingly creating a standardized approach to how they are evaluating risk, whether there are use cases that are going to be prohibited or not.
What are some of those use cases that might be prohibited? What are the higher stakes use cases?
So I think what I can only speak to right now are certain activities that are already out there by the Department of Defense. So I'd point you to DoD directives and other things, but those are things that we're building on for the work that we're doing now. But you can imagine we're talking about agencies as diverse as the Department of Defense on one end, and for example, the U.S. Agency for International Development on the other end. And they all have kind of different missions, different requirements, and we want to make sure that we're addressing all of them in a way that's flexible enough. And also, I think this is very important as the technology is evolving, is future-proof to the extent possible. How do we create a structure that allows itself to adapt as the technology shifts?
Tarun, will this NSM specifically address cyber capabilities, offensive and defensive, or defensive? How are you thinking about that?
Yes. So look, in the overall effort is to address the full range of capabilities that could be impacted by frontier AI developments, and that, of course, does include cyber operations. Again, as many folks here know, I mean, we already have there's an enormous amount of experimentation in using some of these models to detect potential vulnerabilities, and you just have to expect that there's going to be a lot of potential use of it as well to then exploit those vulnerabilities also. And so we want to make sure that to the greatest extent possible, we're using it to maximize defense for ourselves, to make sure that we're not behind the eight ball in that regard. And that's going to be, to some degree, also a big piece of our partnership with the private sector, where obviously many of our national security agencies are working closely with some of our leading tech companies right now to provide cloud services, for example. And so this has got to be a major piece of that conversation.
So there have been recent reports about the Pentagon's use of clandestine information operations online to try to, counter narratives. For instance, China's pushing narratives, fake narratives about COVID, origination and things like that. Some of these activities have been curtailed, but I wonder whether your NSM will require these defense agencies to comply with, a lot of these activities have to take place on commercial platforms like Facebook or Twitter, now X. So, and they have terms of service. Will your NSM require these firms, the agencies, to comply with the firm's terms of service, most of which bar inauthentic behavior online? So it's sort of an ethical question here, but one that
sure. I think, and I'd distinguish between two elements.
Okay.
These AI capabilities are tools to do things.
Right.
And we are very conscious about the fact that this NSM is not intended to displace existing policy and legal requirements on agencies about what they do around the world. So I think that's where there can be an active debate about what is most effective to do around the world and how the United States government should be engaging in messaging operations, messaging activity. But here, the NSM is going to make sure that it is adhering to not in any way sidelining policy requirements that are there for good reason. And on what you mentioned, for example, the information operations that occurred several years ago, we moved very quickly and very decisively to curtail operations that were of concern, which has been reported publicly, including by, I think, yourself at the Washington Post.
So I wanted to turn to geopolitics for a moment. I just also, how much time? I'm sorry, I lost track of the clock. So, okay. So I really wanted to get into this area, which I think is rich and fascinating with respect to both AI and strategic competition with China. As most of you know, Microsoft recently signed a $1.5 billion investment deal with the AI company G42, which is headquartered in the UAE. It's part of a broader strategic play the administration is making in the Middle East to reduce Chinese influence and presence in the region. Tarun, how well is that working? And what arrangements do you have with countries like the UAE and as well as with Saudi Arabia and Kuwait?
Yeah. So, look, Ellen, as a global matter, we obviously want to see trusted digital infrastructure around the world, and particularly in countries where we have a military presence or strong economic partnerships, both to protect sensitive data, including American data, but also to protect military data, and of course to ensure that advanced technology is not going to competitors where we have a clear, again, policy objective there. So in that context, in a place like the UAE, which you cited, right, where you had G42 working very closely with Huawei, for example, we have an interest in changing that picture, right? And so we see kind of the effort to work with Microsoft as an alternative to Huawei is generally a positive development and one that we want to encourage. I think at the same time, right, where you have a legacy of working with an untrusted vendor for a really long time, the associated infrastructure, personnel, all the things that come with that, it's going to take some time to kind of fully make the transition and to build confidence that we're not going to have the kinds of technology leakage that we would worry about. And so I would say this is not unique to the UAE necessarily. It's going to be in any context where that transition is underway. There'll be a lot of work that we have to do together with the relevant partners to make sure that it's complete and we're meeting all the policy goals.
Well, how do you enforce the pledge, be it by G42 or any other company that might have a deal, the pledge that they are cutting Huawei or the Chinese firms from their supply chains?
Yeah, look, it's going to vary by context. In some cases, we will have direct conversations with the government about that process. In other cases, it may be a U.S. vendor that itself is going to want those assurances because they generally want to continue working with the U.S. government, right, on those transitions globally and be a partner to U.S. government to help make those transitions in countries where that's willing to happen. So it's going to be, in many cases, an all of the above approach to make sure that those commitments are seen through.
Is there anything similar work going on in Saudi, Maher?
I would defer to
or perhaps with respect as well to the Saudi-Israel normalization issues.
So look, I'll just say, I think we're having these conversations in many countries. There are a lot of them around in the Middle East right now, and part of the reason for that, Ellen, is that there is a very high conviction about the coming capabilities of AI in the Middle East right now. We see that in the UAE, we see it in Saudi and other countries in the region. And as part of that, countries want to know, well, how do we get access to some of this most advanced technology? And from our perspective, given that we, for all the reasons we've talked about earlier, want to safeguard it for national security reasons, we have to have a conversation about what is the digital infrastructure that it's going to ride on and where it's going to be safeguarded. And so that's definitely an ongoing discussion.
So diversion issues aside, are you at all concerned that the UAE, Saudi, and other countries in the Middle East with poor human rights records, as well as massive amounts of money and cheap electricity, will become the center of the world's AI ecosystem? And are you concerned that they might turn these capabilities to engage in human rights violations?
Do you want to start on that one?
Sure. Sure. Is that because I...
Jump ball.
Yeah. I think what I can say, just building on what Tarun said, this is a conversation we're having with a number of countries around the world. I think it's a reflection of the moment that we're in, which is that right now the United States is home to the advanced technology, to the main companies, and to the talent base that is necessary to build this. I think this raises a kind of fundamental questions for us over time, over how we want to ensure that we are maintaining the U.S. leadership role in this space and securing U.S. leadership, but also balancing that and working with partners around the world in a way that is both effective for our national security, but also true to our values. So without answering your question directly, I think this is something that we're wrestling with right now with regard to a lot of countries, and is something that I think is going to play out actually over the next few months and years, because we're actually at that first, if you want, the first stage of that process, which is not unique to this issue, but this is one that I think, as Tarun says, both has revolutionary potential, but also we're starting to see governments have real conviction about wanting to play in this space.
No, I would just add, look, I think this is an important question. It's very fair to ask, like, beyond leakage, how are we going to leakage to China? How are we going to think about this set of issues? And we will have to have a conversation with countries around the world about how they plan to use these capabilities, right? And so, if you're talking about countries that have a really robust internal surveillance apparatus, then we have to think about how exactly will they use these capabilities to supercharge that kind of surveillance, and what will that look like? How will they use, very advanced, analytics that may enable them to do, micro prediction, right, on particular individuals who live in the country or visitors who live in that country. They have access to all of that data. That is something we have to look at, I think, as part of our broader policy for it to be sustainable. But to the earlier part of your question, I mean, I have enormous confidence that we will do what we need to do in this country to maintain our leadership, because, we got to this place, without a lot, frankly, of, focused government support really on, we had enormous investments by some of our leading companies that brought us to this place where we have this lead right now. But we did it kind of without the focus on the hardware that's necessary to do this. We did it without actually a lot of focus necessarily on the power infrastructure that's going to be needed, which you asked about earlier. Yeah. But now I think there's conviction at the top by the president himself, right, about the need to maintain and extend our leadership in this area, and among many of our allies as well, which will absolutely be part of doing this together, and among democratic and like-minded countries in particular.
And Ellen, if I can just add one thing. So in addition to the human rights concerns that you mentioned and that Tarun mentioned, from my perch, so I'm also responsible for counterintelligence policy for the US government. I think we also have to have an eye, again, not addressing a specific country here, but as this technology develops, as it is adopted worldwide, what are the counterintelligence implications for the US government? What are the risks, not just on human rights grounds, but also in terms of the security and the counterintelligence risks to our personnel around the world? So that is something that I think we have to be very mindful of. And that's sometimes an area where both human rights concerns and counterintelligence concerns can actually merge together, because we also want to make sure that we are protecting the US government and our capabilities and our people in the process.
Will that be in the unclassified portion of the NSM? No. Okay, I want to get to questions from the audience, but I just wanted to get to one more piece here, which is important, and because you all have hinted at it, and it's the dialogue issues, dialogue both with China as well as with allies and partners, right? So the Biden administration recently held a dialogue with China on AI. Interestingly, your Chinese counterpart was the Foreign Ministry's Director General for North America, not exactly the person who runs AI policy, or even like you, Tarun, knows AI issues well. But so tell me, what, if any, meaningful progress did you make, or was this dialogue for the sake of dialogue? Did you make any concessions regarding the US's use of AI? Did you seek any concessions from China? Kurt Campbell earlier mentioned that he suggested that China had particular concerns with challenges posed by AI to nuclear command and control. Did that arise? Is that an area you agreed to focus on? Tell us a little more about that dialogue.
So yeah, just on the issue you last raised, like our position has been publicly clear for a very long time. We don't think that autonomous systems should be getting near any decision to launch a nuclear weapon. That's long stated US policy, I think widely agreed by our allies around
including
the world.
China?
Sorry, not agreed by China to date, not agreed by China to date. We think any country, all countries around the world should sign up to that. We think that makes a lot of sense to do. But with respect to the dialogue itself, I think the view is that as these systems become more powerful, we should simply have a venue to talk about risks and safety. And this was the first, instantiation of that dialogue right now. I think to start with, I think we have to kind of work through, do we come to the table with similar views about where the capability is going and what risk and safety might look like that in that context. And so, hopefully this is simply a channel that's going to remain open. It's not a venue for us in any way to negotiate our technology protection measures. Those are not up for negotiation, but it is a venue for us just to exchange views on risk and safety, and then to have a channel open if and when that becomes useful and needed.
And then you've done work as well with the G7, the Trade and Technology Council, with the EU, the summits in the UK and Seoul, and one upcoming in Paris. So what has come of all these efforts, and are you seeing allies buying into your approach at all?
Yeah, well, what you are seeing through some of the summits in particular is the leading companies developing and deploying this technology, signing up to certain commitments, which is positive. Some of those may then become the basis for more formal regulation or legislation, not just in the United States, but in other countries. I think the other dimension of it is that you're seeing now the safety institutes, for example, here in the UK and other countries, now using that as a venue to come together and figure out how can they coordinate, collaborate on developing and deploying evaluations and tests along the lines that we were talking about earlier. So I think that's all very positive. In addition, we've established, we have what we're calling a contact group of around 40 countries where we talk about general AI governance issues. And that's also been a very useful informal mechanism to coordinate on a range of AI governance topics.
So let's open it up to the audience. If you'd raise your hand and wait for the mic to come your way. Yes, second row. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Alice Zhang. I am a China-Taiwan SME subject matter expert for Indo-Pacific Command. And so I think what you discussed is very interesting. And my question is, we talked a lot about how to apply AI, and specifically in defense. And a concern that I have is that with cultures or countries with deep culture and social influence, such as the Middle East or China, specifically on their language, how can we eliminate some of the risks of using AI and generating wrong or misleading results? And how do we mitigate that risk? Thank you.
Do you want to?
Sure. Yeah. So I think, especially in the intelligence sphere, I think we're very conscious about ensuring that any adoption will have to meet the rigorous analytic tradecraft requirements and standards that exist. And here, I think that's kind of the value of experimentation on more advanced models over time will bear fruit, is understanding the extent to which it can be built into current tradecraft to ensure that the results are those that are not misleading, and that ultimately analysts, to the extent that they are using these tools, are not relying or using it as a crutch, if you want, for the work that they're doing. So we think there's ultimately there's a balance here, there's a trade-off of how do we integrate to the extent that it makes sense into the procedures we have now to ensure that it can help rather than ultimately hurt, both in the analytic work that's being done, but also for other activities, including for cyber defense, for example.
Hi, Manish Walterpuri, former director of cyber risk for the city of New York. I also work on supply chain and critical infrastructure issues. So my question is about supply chain. How do you think about the supply chain of artificial intelligence that is unique and different, not data centers, not cloud computing, but things like data labeling or model optimization? Those are a new layer, new sets of companies. So how do you think about that from a counterintelligence perspective, foreign ownership, but also their cyber posture? And related to that, open source that's used in machine learning. Those aren't companies, those are projects maintained by interested groups of people. So be curious to hear how you are thinking about that. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. So look, I think some of this is not necessarily so different from the way that the Defense Department or the intelligence community works with other vendors, right? So they are actively working with companies that do exactly this kind of work. As you know, I'm sure. And so kind of a lot of the policies and rules that apply in other contexts are going to apply here as well. I think on the open source question, I think there is, I'll give you an example. I mean, I think sometimes we'll hear, the United States is trying to lock things down, right? Not allow the world to benefit from, all the tremendous potential, right, of these developments in AI. And look, if you look around the world and see where and how open source is being exploited, it is largely American models, right, that are operative around the world, and they're being fine-tuned and used for all sorts of amazing things. And so in many ways, that is a good thing for the country and for our like-minded countries as well. I think that it's our job as a government, obviously, to kind of think about the capabilities of any model, right, and what the risks are overall. But whether we're talking about just open source software like Linux, right, so on and so forth, this shouldn't be such a binary debate. I think we can recognize the advantages and the tremendous opportunities of open source, and then we can also think about what the risks might be at a certain level of capability. We just have to do both.
And if you do determine there's a certain risk, is there any thought given to ways in which you might either ask for voluntary commitments or regulate them, these open source models?
So the executive order already kind of does this through a notification requirement when you hit a certain compute threshold. I think we could all agree that a compute threshold isn't, necessarily the most straightforward way to evaluate risk, but we do that for now while we're also working through the Safety Institute to develop many more specific evaluations and tests. But this is just an ongoing conversation, not just in the executive branch, but also on Capitol Hill as well.
Thank you. Sir.
Ken Wasserman, I'm an attorney. To follow up on your discussions that you say you've had with China, if there was a mutual expression of will, might there be any area that China and the US could cooperate within AI to their mutual benefit? And if so, what might those be?
Look, I think this remains an open question in part because the first step is to try to come to some sort of common understanding about what the leading risks are and how we would go about evaluating those risks as well. And that's kind of this is an opening bid on that conversation right now. So, there are a number of people here actually who participated in track 2 conversations with the PRC on AI issues for some time. And I think all of them could tell you, if you look at kind of some of the sampling of attitudes in those groups, we actually currently don't have necessarily a lot of overlap on what the risks are right now. And so that alone, I think, would take us one step forward if we could come to some semblance of agreement.
How would you characterize how China views the risks? What do they see as the AI risks beyond nuclear command and control?
Well, look, I don't want to speak to kind of private diplomatic discussions generally. I think sometimes there is kind of a message delivered to us, which is, the West can afford to be worried about risk and safety, and we'll just focus on deployment, right? And to us, that's not a healthy or sustainable way to think about this. We also are focused on deployment and the applications of this technology for development around the world, and that's happening right now. But we can also be worried about risk and safety and try to come to consensus with countries about that. And our view is we just have to do both.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from our virtual audience.
We'll take our next question from Mickey Canton. Ms. Canton, please accept the unmute now prompt. Looks like we're experiencing technical difficulties. We'll go back to the room.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Ryan Bugis. Thank you so much. Can you talk a little bit more about how you're thinking about the incentive structure to build and maintain tech talent in the government and how you're thinking about approaching that going forward?
Sorry, okay, I'll start. Mario, you should come in too. So, look, there are a number of things going on. One is if you look at, the new director at the National Science Foundation, right, that's still doesn't have the appropriations, right, that have been authorized, but there actually is a kind of much more liberal pay structure in part to try to attract more tech talent. But I'll tell you, like my experience from working with colleagues over the last few years, and this is not just on AI. If you look at to her credit, the Secretary of Commerce has been able to attract really great, incredible talent to the CHIPS office, right, from many sectors, right, to execute that program. I think we see really high conviction for people who want to spend maybe not their whole career, but some years in government on work that they think is really meaningful and important for the U.S. government and for the country. And so I think that actually, I'll just speak personally here. I think that the biggest draw for many people who want to work on this is there a critical mass of people who get it, who want to work on this issue and have high conviction about it? And if there is, there are all kinds of ways to make that work. Now, over the long term, obviously, we need to have a steady pipeline, right? And we're doing that through, I think, more fellowships in the government now. I think there's much more active recruiting efforts. Some of you maybe participated in the AI Expo that happened downtown a couple of months ago, which was a great recruiting opportunity actually for a lot of departments and agencies as well, but also creating a pipeline from places inside the government that have a lot of tech already, like some of our research labs in the military services or in the national labs administered by DOE into policy roles as well.
And I would just say many of the challenges and bottlenecks that exist in other areas also apply here. So the speed with which someone can get a security clearance, for example, the ability to get hired by particular agencies, especially in the IC, can take a long time, not just because of the security clearance, but for other reasons. Pay obviously is an issue. All of those, we're very conscious of all those issues, but I also think there is an excitement to work on AI policy that I think is also kind of attracting. The question is, how do you ensure that becomes an actual pipeline that's sustainable and it's for the long haul? And I think those are going to be things that we're going to start trying to tackle in the NSM, but it's going to be something that's going to take it's going to require a combination of ultimately, I think, policy as well as statutory help over time.
Mm-hmm. Way in the back there. Yeah.
Thank you. Trevor Honeycutt, Reuters. Does the White House have a view on this proposed bill that would make it easier to impose export controls on AI models? Thank you.
So I think I'm aware of the bill that you're talking about. I think that's a bill that we have provided technical assistance on, and we're still continuing to work with some of the drafters on it. I think we understand what's driving it right now. I think it speaks to the earlier conversation we were having, which is we need to look at the capabilities of any model, right? Whether it doesn't matter whether it's an open source or proprietary model, and that should be tagged to kind of what are the specific risks that we are worried about. But I think as we understand it, that bill is really focused on providing authorities right now, but it's one that we're in ongoing discussion about with folks on the Hill.